Howdy, everyone. Welcome to Chicago. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Chicago, this is Wrigley Field, home of the Chicago Cubs. We were going to include the other baseball team's park as well in the interest of fair play, but it turns out, one, they were not involved in the Ferris Bueller's Day Off movie, and two, they foolishly renamed themselves Guaranteed Rate Field. No, I'm not kidding. And we just didn't want to put that on a slide. We can't really explain why, but it made us uncomfortable. You are here in the ACME working group. If this is not where you intended to be and you'd like to just relax and sit with us, that's fine. But we also won't be offended if you collect your agenda and go find out where you're supposed to be. This is the note well. If you've already seen the note well this week, please hum now. If you haven't seen the note well this week, please hum now. Delightful. So I won't have to go into why you care. Okay, so here's our agenda for today. The 10 minutes of administrivia is mostly me blathering up here. Then we'll have a discussion of the changes in the ACME internet draft and go into the rest of the things as you see here. We do have thanks to give out already to DKG for acting as our Jabber relay and to Thomas as acting as our scribe. So you won't have to sit here in stunned silence while I stare out looking for them. Please thank them for their work. Are there any bashes to the agenda before we move into our main presentation? Wait, you're going to bash the agenda?
Yeah. I sent you a bash email before the meeting, but you didn't incorporate it. No. Yeah, so if you look at the doc that you yourself uploaded, the changes in the ACME ID draft has a few points for discussion that might overrun that 20-minute slot.
Okay.
Okay, if we just steal from the 40 minutes.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I wasn't too worried about how much time each one takes because these are all false estimates, as we all know. They come out of Number Wang, a great game if you've never played. So if there are no bashes to the topics on there, I think we'll go ahead and ask Richard to come on. Change what's
ACME. So we've been at this for 2 years now? 2 years since
who's counting?
Something like that. So since the last time, so I'm hoping, go to the next slide. I think the theme here is that there's nothing too big because we've been through last call now. We got a bunch of good issues. And hopefully we're getting about done and I can send this to the IESG. So the reason we don't want to have nothing big is that big things require relast calls. And so we'd like to avoid that and keep the document moving. Next slide, please. So a quick review of what we've done since the last IETF meeting. Next slide. The usual graph of commits. As usual, the ID deadline is very clearly indicated by the commit graph over time. As usual, we've kept up our pace of having a bunch of different contributors, and thanks to all of those people who sent pull requests or reviewed pull requests, helped keep this pace pretty lively through the winter. Next slide, please. So just a quick review here. There's a bunch of editorial PRs that improve grammar and commas and terminology and things like that. Next slide. Several PRs that we agreed at the last IETF that we would do. Some of these are pretty technical and pretty significant, but they've already been discussed, so I'm not going to discuss them further here. Next slide. One of those major technical changes was to change the names that we apply to things, changing registrations to accounts, and it was a new certificate to a new order. There were a few PRs related to just kind of cleaning up terminology from that and making sure that we were consistent in saying everything the same way throughout the document. Next. Finally, a bunch of what we got in last call was comments about the kind of general data model that the protocol has, and had kind of accreted over the couple of years we've been working on this. And some of the reviewers noted that there were several things in there that we weren't using anymore and could safely take out. So, for example, the account object had reflected the public key associated to the account, so that, you know, if you requested your account object from the server, it would say, here's the contact information I have, and here's the public key I have. The observation Jacob made that convinced me this was not useful, reflecting the key wasn't useful, is that the client needs to have the key in the first place to make the request, because requests for account objects are access controlled. And so there really is zero utility in reflecting that back, because the fact that the server is sending this account object to the client is already proof that the client has the key that goes with the account. So we took that out, and similar arguments for these other things. So just lots of cleanup going on. That's why we do working group last calls, is to discover what we've done wrong so far. Next. Similarly, a bunch of small things like changing content location to location, revising how opinionated we were about HPKP and redirects, and tweaking some HTTP response codes. So, you know, things that if people were being super precise about things like response codes might require some code changes, but, you know, just changing from like 201 to 204. So not major stuff, but still, you know, if you've got an implementation going, you might have to tweak to address these things. Next. All right, that's the entire history, the summary of the history to here. Any questions, comments on what we've done in the last few months? Like I said, I don't think there's anything major there, no major re-architecting, mainly just streamlining and tweaking things to be a little more consistent and nicer. All right, so let's skim through the open issues. So for each of these open PRs, open issues in GitHub, and mailing list issues, I've got kind of started with those three bins, kind of triage those into things that look like things that Jacob and I could just triage and decide for ourselves, and things that I thought merited some discussion here. For these, you know, those are the PRs we have open right now that are mainly just editorial, fairly minor things that I don't think we need to spend meeting time on here, unless someone has a really strong opinion about URIs versus URLs. I know that's something some people get exercised about. Anyone want to go to the mic on that? I'm not seeing anyone leaping up. The one I wanted to discuss here was to decide once and for all which challenge names we use once this goes to RFC. Next slide. So the current document says, hey, we're attaching draft numbers to these challenge names right now because we might revise them as we go through the internet draft IETF process. But dear IANA, dear RFC editor, once this becomes an RFC, please strip those version numbers and just use the bare tokens. The idea here is that, you know, these are nice, clean, human intelligible names that are cleaner for all the future usage post RFC. And, you know, everyone likes to say the future is bigger than the past. So we might as well make it clean for the big future and not constrain them with the legacy of the early implementation we've done here. Roland pointed out that this is kind of silly. It causes breakage for the non-trivial number of clients that are out there already. And it's kind of handy, actually, to have these version numbers around on challenges, because we might discover some future date that we're unhappy with precisely how the HTTP challenge works. We might want to upgrade it to have another version of the HTTP challenge. Does anyone have a preferred color for this bike shed? Okay, I think the direction we're headed right now, I think Roland is pretty enthusiastic about keeping the version numbers around, and I think he's pretty well sold me, so there's no objections to that.
So just to be clear, the first column and the third column are the same, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct. Yeah, so the proposal is to keep what we have now. We might have to change the semantics, because right now it says that the version number is the draft version in which the change was introduced. So we might just have to register things with the version attached. But
Yeah. I mean, if we were voting, Eric or Scrolla, if we were voting, I'd vote for features bigger than the past, but I also am not like willing to like go to the matrices for it.
yeah. Any other opinions? Daniel, you're next to the mic.
Daniel McCarney. I kind of agree with Roland's position on here. I think that the state of the ecosystem and the number of clients that are involved, I'd rather just keep it the way it is. I don't think there's significant justification for that breakage.
Mary Barnes, yeah, I mean, I agree, keep it the way it is, and I don't think it's a big deal whether or not it was, version number, blah, blah, blah. Just use these as the identifiers.
Cool.
Register them.
All right. The shed shall be blue then, or whatever color the version numbers are. Okay. Yeah, let the minutes. Yes, the shed shall be versioned, shall we say. To let the minutes reflect, so resolved. Next slide, please. So that was the PRs. There's some issues in GitHub as well. Some of which have already been addressed by PRs that have already landed. So I just struck those through for now, and a couple of which are just minor text tweaks. There were 3 I wanted to run past this group real quick. So next few slides. Let's Encrypt pinged me with an issue they'd had with some clients with bugs that would, clients had some bugs that would create a bunch of pending authorizations as they were trying to get the client working. And because Let's Encrypt rate limits pending authorizations, says you can only have so many outstanding authorizations, they got into this state where they were wedged and like they couldn't try anymore to get their client working because they've already created so much state on the server. And to compound that, so we built in this nice deactivation of authorization so that you could kind of deal with this situation if you had the URL for the authorization to say deactivate this authorization. But these clients, because they were still trying to get things working, weren't keeping those authorization URLs around, so they couldn't use the deactivation thing. Josh from Let's Encrypt called me and said, hey, we have this issue. The question is, should we address this? Bottom bolts are kind of my opinion here. I think it's probably not worth addressing this super specifically, but it seemed like one way you could address this while having a fairly high degree of generality is re-adding this authorizations field to the account object so that an account holder could enumerate all of the authorizations that have been attached to this account over time. That seems like kind of an okay idea to me, just in terms of exposing server state. And it would have the handy effect of addressing this. Jacob, in the queue? Oh.
Hi. So as someone else from Let's Encrypt, I have a slightly different opinion than Josh. And I think he and I should actually probably talk about this, but I think this can actually be solved by the server choosing to recycle pending authorizations. So in other words, and this is actually accounted for in the latest version of the spec. So if you ask for a new order and there's already exists a pending authorization for one of those names, the server is free to, and it's kind of encouraged to reuse that same authorization. So I think this will just become a non-issue with the latest spec. And I don't think we need to look this far.
Jacob, would you have any objection to adding this authorizations field to accounts just for completion?
You can get to the authorizations through the orders, so it seems like extra complexity for not a lot of blame.
Sid?
Sid Hardy. I was actually going to say something quite similar to what Jacob said, but slightly different mechanism. I think you could also deal with this by having either a timeout or an overflow on pending authorization. So you want the right limit to keep you from just getting overloaded with them, but you could also have a simple timeout that says they age out of the queue if unaddressed or if a certain number have come in, and this would keep you from having to add anything to the protocol to deal with it, especially since this is caused by buggy clients. Adding protocol frogs to deal with buggy clients doesn't strike me as particularly useful, where at least adding an age to old things so that they age out anyway can also deal with failure modes in the network, where somebody requests something and then there's a network breakage. It means they can't actually come back to it.
I believe that pending authorizations are already required to have an expires field.
In which case,
So
I think this
was at worst a temporary wedge.
Yeah, it can't. Given that they already have an expires field, I think that adding more props for this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Personally.
Okay. Daniel, did you have any further on that?
Daniel McCartney. No, I just wanted to echo that we do have an expires field on there. I think presently for Let's Encrypt it's somewhere around the order of 7 days, and so this is really just a problem for people that hit that limit and don't want to wait 7 days and don't have the authorization URLs.
Yeah. And obviously, if CAs had concern about this, they could tweak that expiry window downwards. Yep. Okay. So I'll take. I think this is a no action on this one. We can just close the issue. All right. This is a super minor thing. I think Jacob suggested this. Right now, this is kind of the entirety of the recommendations we have for client behavior in terms of how you go through the sequence of requests getting a certificate. And the recommendation here is that, once you've gone through the whole submission of an order and you've tried to respond to the challenges, you need to see when it is that the server thinks it has validated your challenges or it's made up its mind. This recommendation is that you pull the authorization URL, of which there might be several for a given certificate. The suggestion here is just to change that to pulling the order URL, which is actually more efficient because that gives you the certificate URL. Just wanted to put this out there on the floor because it is kind of a technical change that seemed sensible to folks. Not seeing any dramatic reactions. Oh, Jacob, back to you.
All right, so I don't actually remember recommending this. It might be somebody else who recommended this. One possible issue is, so if one of the authorizations fail, well, so connected to the point Hugo raised about retrying individual challenges, if we allow that, the order won't transition when challenges fail. So you would pull in the case where the challenges fail, you would wind up pulling the order forever. So I think there's some interaction there and would favor, we should continue to recommend get auth for now, but I could totally be convinced.
So, Jacob, where did that end up? Are you okay with this change, or did you want to do something different?
I think we should leave it as is for now, based on Hugo's feedback about retryable challenges.
Okay, so maybe let's table this until we get to that, which is a little bit later. We can revisit this at the end. Not a huge change. It's not really normative anyway, so we can always tweak. All right, next issue here. Resource relations. So someone pointed out, I forget who exactly it was, that we have this link relation between an authorization and the order that created it. But authorizations can be used across multiple orders. So, I submit an order for example.com and I get authorization for example.com, and then I issue 200 more certificates using that authorization. Which link, what do I set this uplink relationship to when I get that authorization resource? Seems like there's kind of three obvious answers. One, you set it's the order that created the authorization. You provision 200 link relations to each order that used this authorization, or you could just delete this entirely and rely on clients tracking which orders go which with authorizations. I think my preference would probably be to just drop it because I don't get the sense that there's a lot of usage of these link relations going on. But if people thought this was valuable in terms of tying all these resources together, I think there could be some argument for keeping them.
Does anybody have an implementation that's currently relying on this link relation?
Jacob, I see you at the mic. Do you have a comment, or is that just legacy?
Legacy.
Okay.
If only we could do that in real life. Track towards the next vendor.
All right, not hearing anyone standing up for the continued presence of this link relation, I'm going to go ahead. I'll propose we go ahead and delete it. Okay. Then we're on to mailing list issues. These are kind of the threads that I saw on the mailing list that were not filed as issues and not resolved. There may be some more. I think the chairs have a couple on the agenda that are bigger issues. So yeah, let's go through these real quick. Next slide, please. Defining revocation more clearly. So Erica Portnoy suggested that our description of revocation is kind of ambiguous because it's got all these shoulds scattered throughout it about what the client has to do to prove that he's authorized to revoke a certificate. Now, our default, we are fairly conservative in this specification about what we require a server to do because servers are bound by things like the baseline requirements and root programs as to what exactly they can do and can't do. However, in this case, you are within the scope of the revocation mechanism that ACME defines. And so it seemed to me like you could perhaps safely within that box, say that change these shoulds to musts, and say the revocation method that ACME defines within that scope, the server has to consider any of these three keys to be valid. Erica's suggestion was that we require at least one of these three, which is a little bit more limited in terms of the burden it places on the server, but it seems also confusing from the client point of view because you don't know which of those three a given server is going to support. So I'm kind of looking at the CA guys in the room who happen to be next to the mic. If we were to change these to musts, and so that would require that if someone shows up who was the issuer of the certificate, that seems kind of obvious, but someone who has proven control of the same set of domains in the certificate or the private key that goes with the certificate, like would you be willing to accept revocation from any of those three entities?
I don't see any issue with these three entities. Clint Wilson, DigiCert. I don't see any issue with any of these three entities requesting revocation and honoring that request.
Does that generally match your revocation practices today?
Yeah, outside of the out-of-band report mechanisms that don't come from the certificate or the account holder, this maps directly what we do for the account holders.
Okay. And then Let's Encrypt guys, I think you already do all of these things. So.
Yeah, Daniel McCarney, we already implement all of them. So as far as I'm concerned, requiring all of them seems fine to me.
Okay, so the upshot here is, we'll change these to musts. Then it's kind of a take it or leave it for CAs. So like either you do all these things and you get to use ACME revocation, or you have to invent your own revocation thing. All right, so if people are okay with that, we'll just change those two shoulds to musts. Good resolution. Next. So there's a provision in here that servers should validate, should make sure that they kind of like the URIs that are provided in these contact fields when accounts are registered. There is some concern about interoperability impact because there's not any way for the server to advertise what URLs might be acceptable to it. I think general practice among the CAs that have deployed ACME so far is that mail to and tell are kind of the obvious ones to accept. But you might have some other scheme that some CAs might accept, some might not. And if a client wants to use that, it doesn't know whether a given CA is going to accept that or not. So there's a request to add some stuff perhaps to the metadata section of the directory to indicate what schemes would be acceptable. Daniel, I think you'd commented on some on the list.
Yeah, Daniel McCarney again. So from my perspective, I think the main criticism here was that it was difficult to determine whether the contact was invalid or unsupported. And I think if we added an error type unsupported, that seems better to me. The metadata aspect of it, I mean, right now the spec says that the metadata element in the directory is may. And so I think if we're really looking to clear out all the confusion, we would have to change that to a normative must. And I think this is probably not the only place where an ACME client that's meant to be generalized across multiple ACME CAs will run into one feature or another that isn't supported. And so I kind of land on the side of having a simpler server and a smarter client that's able to handle those errors. I think the other aspect here for this particular one is that this is likely to only come up during account registration and contact update. And so I think the UX downside of submitting multiple contacts, finding it back that one of them is unsupported, not really a big deal.
Ted Hardy. So there's a general point here that if you're going to have multiple different permitted URI schemes, you run the risk of negotiation failure, where the ones that are supported by the client and the ones supported by the server do not have an intersection point. Typically, we solve that by declaring a mandatory to implement that everybody knows will be supported. Yes, and I think a single one of mail to is probably sufficient if people want to have two mandatory to implement. I would agree that, sorry? I reflect to the record that my colleague, Reverend Riscorla, prefers Moz : as the second one. I personally believe that would require a little bit more discussion, proof of interoperable implementations, a few other things. But I think a single MTI is probably sufficient. If we do want to have two tell, is probably okay. But I think that also means you could, for this particular thing, although not probably for Daniel's larger point, still leave the metadata thing as optional because you would be able to use the MTI. There may be other cases that he's thinking of where you wouldn't have an MTI and that ceases to become.
I mean, the other thing you could also do is have a little bit of a negotiation mechanism where if you guess wrong and provide something that the server doesn't like and it provides you back an unsupported scheme mechanism, the server could say, here's the list of schemes I do like. At the error stage, as opposed to.
Yes, you could do it that way,
upfront.
both for this and for others. And obviously, in that case, the server would always include the MTI in that list.
Daniel McCartney. So I just wanted to mention that if we require a set right now, Let's Encrypt only supports mail to, so I think that would probably be the best one to go with.
So I think the minimum approach here seems to be just to add mail to as a minimum required scheme. Seems like that would address most of the issue here because you could always fall back to just mail to. So unless folks think we need some more metadata or this negotiation, it seems like we could also add those in extensions in the future. So I'm inclined just to scope down and declare the MTI. All right, I'm seeing some nods, so we'll go with that. All right, next. Yeah, this is the challenging one. So Hugo Landau observed on the list that you can end up in these situations where I submit an order for a certificate that has 10 names in it. I try to go fulfill the challenges for those names, and 9 of them work, but in one case, the DNS didn't propagate quite fast enough, and so that challenge failed, that authorization got invalidated. In that case right now, the best the client can do is to restart the whole order process and create a new order, which consumed a fair bit of server resources. You get some benefit because the 9 that did succeed should carry over and be reused in the new authorization, although that's not guaranteed. It's up to the CA's policy. And so the question here is, should we do something that addresses this case a little more elegantly? Hugo posited 3 potential mechanisms. One, allowing a mechanism for retrying a challenge so that if a challenge, if CA tries to validate a challenge and it fails, the client can maybe kick the server and say, please retry this challenge, retry to validate it again. Another option he proposed was to allow challenges to be regenerated. So an authorization comes with a list of challenges. If one of those gets invalidated, maybe we want to give the client a way to say, please give me a new list of challenges to prove that I own this same domain. You could also do this similar dance at the authorization level, getting a new authorization within a given order. One thing that occurs to me we could also do here is kind of address this just from the CA side. I mean, it seems like if CAs weren't quite so aggressive about invalidating challenges if they don't work the first time, then you might not need such mechanism here. So, if the worry were things like DNS propagation, you might avoid a bunch of these errors if the CA were just willing to try again in a couple minutes, or maybe have some expanding window of retries of validation over time. And that wouldn't require any protocol change. We could just add some, non-normative recommendation where we recommend CAs retry some of these things in order to allow for clients getting everything arranged properly. Jacob.
Hi. So I agree with you that your 4th entry, that CAs retry validation queries, that was kind of my first instinct of this seems like the best way to fix this. The problem is you do want to kind of have exponential backup, like try again in a minute, try again in 5 minutes, an hour, up like a day, or maybe even up to a week. We do actually have some clients who, create authorizations and then on the order of days deploy something. And the problem with that is if you are in the window where we tried it at the 1 hour mark and now you're waiting for the 1 day mark for us to try again, like that's really hard for you to debug. And you actually want to be able to say, okay, I fixed the thing, try it again now. You in this case, yeah.
I'm trying to imagine, like, mechanism-wise, what that would look like. I mean, if it were something like, I take the same payload the same payload that I posted before I re-sign it, and I post it to the challenge again. CA verifies that it's the same payload, and if so, retries the validation. Is that something like what you'd be imagining here for the mechanism?
Yeah. And so also the question is, during those automatic retries by the CA, what's the status of the authorization? You know, it's not invalid yet, but most clients probably, you know, in the straightforward case, most clients want to return to the user and say, this was the error we got. Here's how you fix it.
It seems like you could, I think my opening offer for that would be to keep it in a pending state, but then have like a list of error results that the CA had gotten. So if you observe that the challenge is still pending, but now it's got an error attached to it, then you can infer that the CA has not succeeded at validating it and provide that error back to the user.
Yeah. One problem we have then is associating error results with attempts. So, you know, if you have a list of these are the error results we've gotten so far, and the client just tried again, how does the client know, based on this recent try, did I get a fresh error?
Yeah, so you want to like define an order to the error results or a timestamp or something like that. Yeah. That seems pretty lightweight to me. You know, with the repost and keep pending, having a list of unsuccessful attempts, probably big enough to require a new last call. But this seems like a problem that is likely to come up for people, worth resolving. So, does that approach seem sensible to people? Seeing some nods from.
Okay, so if there's anybody who objects to this approach, now would be a good time to think. It will cause us to recycle the working group last call. It's a big enough change for that. So understand that that's a consequence if we make this change. I don't see an objection, so it sounds like the next step would be for the editors to make this change, and then when we issue a new working group last call, we'll call it out as one of the changes.
I think Jacob and I should have a triage and land bugs call in the next few days. I think that's the last one. Is there any more here? Oh yeah, this one. I got no dog in this fight, but is Sean Leonard in the room?
He actually noted on the mailing list that he had a conflict for this, so I'm going to actually ask Russ. Have you followed the mailing list discussion of this? Okay, so he's arguing that what we're proposing here is functionally equivalent to doing a text plane encoding, and that creating a new listing for text plane is not sensible. And he's suggesting that we go to a DER rather than a PEM, concatenated DER, I believe. So, Rich, do you want to comment from the floor on this?
Sure, yeah. Rich speaking as colleague who talked with Sean yesterday. There's two issues. One, because of the other RFC he referenced in his email, don't call it PEM. There's a specific format, a name for the format, right? That's just an editorial issue. The other thing he was suggesting, and we'll have to do a consensus, I think, is rather than have, base 64 character encoding, just output it in, say, any kind of arbitrary DIR order. For example, the one he recommended at the end was use the TLS certificate list ordering.
Right, and put it into a JSON structure so that you're not serializing this as US ASCII in any point.
Exactly. The counter argument I gave to him.
Sorry? Oh, he changed it again. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, okay. The counter argument I gave was a text file with a bunch of PEM certs in an order is accepted by the most popular web servers out there. So it seems changing it for geek aesthetics as opposed to pragmatism.
Yeah, I think as I recall, we originally had just DIR as the way you return your certificate, and the reason we changed that was for developer friendliness to match what was accepted as input by most of the industry. It turns out there is kind of a de facto standard there. And so I agree with Rich that I'm hesitant to move away from that unless there's some agreement, there's some other standard coming up. So yeah, what's the latest?
So Carl Maynard, the latest about 2 hours, 1 hour ago-ish, is to take the DIR, same format, but in between the certs, have those quoted as base 64, comma separated in JSON. It
Yeah.
Yes.
It,
But still don't call it PIM since it's not a PIM.
okay,
Yeah. What?
What's your name?
Eric Scorla. I mean, I don't care if we call it PIM or SHMIM or Quick or whatever, but like,
Yeah.
let us use the format that people in fact expect their servers to accept.
Russ, would you like to chime in on this?
So it seems the top one, PIM, is highly implemented, right? I don't care what you call it, but there's an RFC that it calls it PIM that you can reference. The next one is you're just trying to be flexible in the order, which I don't believe the first one imposes. And the third one is two encodings of the same structure, one with the MIME wrapper and one
Oh, yeah,
without.
no, yeah, I meant the second bullet as a clarification first. So Sean in his email listed that MIME type out, and I was just trying to do the working group a favor of saying, what does that actually indicate, which is assigned data struct.
Right, but it's the degenerate one where there's no content.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have implementations of the first and the third. Either one of them is okay with me. Making up something new doesn't seem to encourage the point.
So let's direct the editors to fix the terminology so it matches the RFC that was referenced and close the issue.
All right, so the proposed resolution to the working group, let's see if anybody objects to this, is to adjust the terminology as was originally suggested in Sean's first message. That's not quite as simple as changing the MIME type. There's also some character set stuff that has to happen. Jacob, you want to propose a different resolution or a comment on this proposed resolution?
Well, yeah, comment. So very recently on the list, just in the last like hour or two, Sean raised what I actually thought was a really good point, which is that if the client naively copies the PEM certificate chain into a file to be loaded by, say, Nginx or Apache, which is what we expect them to do, it's the obvious thing, the CA can slip a private key in there, and those web servers will interpret that to say, oh, I should use this private key rather than the one that I was configured with. So that's potentially a big issue with providing straightforward PEM, even though I like the idea of providing what web servers will use.
That seems like something perhaps we should verify empirically.
Yep, that sounds like a good plan.
So,
If so, perhaps a warning.
yeah, and if so,
Yeah, that
perhaps
could be called out in the
so
security
perhaps file some
consideration.
bugs on some web servers.
And there's a workaround already in that most of the web servers will take one name for the cert list and another name for the server's private key, which presumably the client's done. So I think calling it out as don't do this is more than enough.
I mean, I would hope that these web servers would regard these as untrusted input anyway and be validating they're the right things.
Yep. So back to the proposed resolution. The proposed resolution here is a textual adjustment to correctly identify the MIME type here, which includes character set and the other issues that go along with that. And secondarily, to investigate and potentially add text to the security considerations on the insertion of a private key attack, which Sean raised. Since we are already going to have to go back through working group last call because of the previous issue, there's still some time for on-list discussion of this. Should folks want to refresh themselves on the apparently changing up to the very minute discussion. Gosh, I knew I shouldn't have had lunch. And we can revisit that resolution on list if there's a reason to change. Everybody okay with that resolution?
That is the last one.
Okay.
Oh. I don't know what those big things are.
Those are the other items in the agenda.
Oh, okay, yeah. So we should probably deal with this issue about generating nonsense probabilistically, much as I despise ever discussing whether or not probabilistic generated values are random.
Okay.
And I do note that, like, that this text, when I looked at this PR, right, it didn't require like a minimum length. So I mean, if we want to tell people, so
Is there an issue for this I could bring up and show
the
the?
PR number 289.
Okay, I'll bring it up and.
So again, first let me state that when people generate, that we routinely refer to 128-bit randomly generated values as unique. I do not think that pretending that they are not unique is a useful way to engage with the universe. 160 if you prefer to have if you're really feeling nasty. I don't care how we specify what people do, but I think that if we are gonna say they should be unique and leave it entirely to the server's discretion, that's reasonable. If we're gonna say they should be suggest a random generation, then we should in fact give them guidance on how long it should be.
So would a construction saying that they may either be random of a certain length or more, or constructed to be unique?
Seems to be fine, yeah.
Okay, that seems fine to me. I think we can write this. Daniel, I think you may have been writing the text around this, maybe not. I seem to recall seeing a PR.
Daniel McCartney, no, I think you're confusing it with the token thing. I was not.
Oh, yeah.
It was Jacob who was doing the nonce one.
Yeah. All right. In any case, that seems like a sensible resolution to me. So I think we can make text. With that, I think, yeah.
Oh, okay, so it's too slow. You guys have already fixed it in the meantime.
Yeah, I think we can address this. So with that, whoever was going to discuss. That we will change that to require that the nonces either be constructed so that they are always unique, or if they're randomly generated, then they must have a certain length. So it's 128 bits. Say again?
I believe that's, I can't remember, is it the nonces are required to be 120 bits of entropy, so probably those numbers should be the same number.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
If people feel like 160 is important, I have no beef with 160, but those would be the same number.
Do you want to get the pink box?
That's not me, right?
That's you. It's the CAA requirement.
No,
It's
I mean,
the
I'm
first
not a
of
big
the
thing. Okay.
Oh.
Gee, that's body shaming. Okay, so yeah, there were a couple items raised on the list. One was discussion of whether CAA should be mandatory as part of the validation. I'm not sure what to say other than let's have a few minutes to discuss that. Richard.
No.
Would you care to elaborate, sir? I
I think this is not the domain at which, that is not the level at which this specification is addressed. CAs do any number of things that we actually have a list at the back of the spec of additional things beyond ACME that the CAs should probably do to meet their obligations to the world before they issue a certificate. Checking against high-value names, looking for, PayPal.com-like domains. Things like that. And this would be a natural fit for that list. I think I offered on the mailing list to add it to that list. But it's at a comparable level, and we shouldn't be requiring things at that level. That's more the scope of something like the CAB forms to make it part of that scope.
Ted Hardy, just pointing out that on the list, in fact, Hugo, who raised this issue, or is one of the folks who raised this issue, has pointed out that the CAB forum has now made it mandatory in a document that was issued in March of this year. As a result, the marginal utility of us requiring it as well seems modest is a good description. Is there anybody who wishes to argue at this point that modest utility is worth it? Okay, so this may be not quite as big an issue as we thought.
Seems
good.
bigger.
No one seems to be.
Should we put it in the list at the end? Asking the chairs for a rule.
Okay. Do you want to talk to DNS sec?
Yeah.
So the question was, should we add this to that list in CA considerations? Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, will do.
DNS sec is the next one.
Okay, yeah, okay, so the other issue recently raised on the list was requiring DNSSEC for domain validation. Crickets? Anybody? I don't have any slides. I have a dog in his fight, but he sort of peed on my DNSSEC zone. But
So it looks like, Victor, you're in queue?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We don't see you yet.
Okay. I'm not sharing video.
Then we don't expect to see you anymore.
Right. So it's my contention, since I think I'm the one who raised this issue, that while requiring people to sign their own domains is perceived quite onerous, and many people haven't, that running a validating resolver is rather routine these days. And I think that for folks who have signed their domains and are then going to be using DNS challenges to obtain certificates, it is a very reasonable expectation that the CA would do you the courtesy of validating your DNS responses and not accepting forgeries from any man-in-the-middle attacks. And that the burden on the CA of just spinning up, their favorite resolver and configuring the trust anchor is very minimal. So I would expect, I think reasonably, that the CA can join the millions of people who use 8.8.8.8 or VeriSign's version and so on, and are already using DNSSEC with no noticeable impact as a DNSSEC client, that the CA would also be a DNSSEC client, and that they should just do that, and that this should be mandatory.
Ted Hardy, just a view for the folks in the room, what I believe your proposal is, and confirm with you, you're proposing that should the information which comes back from the client be DNSSEC signed, then the CA should validate the signatures, but you are not suggesting that it must be so signed. Is that correct?
Correct, but a little bit clearer. If the delegation from the parent domains or ultimately from the root, has DS records that the domain should be signed, then the CA will only accept it if suitably signed. Right, so that the CA runs a validating resolver.
This also seems like a question for CAB Forum.
The ACME is very much focused on automated, DV with very little human intervention, sort of certificate issuance. And I think this is squarely appropriate for the kind of mechanisms that ACME is considering.
Ted Hardy, as a sort of a similar clarifying question, are we aware of any CA that would do this check manually if we were doing manual checks now? Are you aware of any CA that would do this in their current process, or whether manual or automated? Okay. Victor, if this were sent in as a suggestion to CAB Forum instead of handled in ACME, what would the functional difference be?
I don't know who the CAs are who aren't already in CAB Forum, so I'm not sufficiently aware of what the differences in practice would be. It just seems to me that if you're implementing this specification, you ought to be aware that the DNS challenge ought to be verified with DNS. And if it's said multiple times, I don't see the harm of saying it multiple times. Just like I don't really, in the previous topic, see the harm of saying that CAA is mandatory, even if CAB Forum already said so. There's no reason not to say so, if it's the case.
Phil Baker. Well, one question will be whether we're talking about a should, which I think is an easy thing to do, or a must. In IETF, Bill, I don't think that this can be a must because it isn't actually a necessity for interoperation, but I could be persuaded otherwise. The issue I would see from the CAB Forum point of view is that we have been very, very careful to avoid endorsing the ICANN route as the root of everything. And for us, that is a showstopper, because we do not know who will be running ICANN in 10 years' time. We do not know who will control it. And there is absolutely no way that we can establish an administrative guarantee that it will be run in an acceptable fashion. So I think that it would be very difficult to get a statement in CAB Forum that these CAs must be subservient to ICANN CA as the root of all things. So that's what
I don't think that's what's happening here. I think this is a little bit different in that what he's talking about is if you're using the DNS challenge. Sorry, Eric, would you like to explain it? Sure.
Well, no, I mean, maybe the DNS challenge, that doesn't make any sense. If this thing says to be DNSSEC signed, then it has to be all the challenges because they all depend on the DNS for verification.
That's true.
I mean, the question is, when you're doing DNSSEC, to say that you've got to check it implies that you're going to check it against some root at some point, and then you get into rootable root things, and that's a problem.
So let me suggest an alternative here that might make a little bit of progress. Instead of describing this as a requirement, why don't we write up what the threat is and include the threat in the security considerations such that somebody in the security considerations sees the potential threat and knows that if a DNSSEC signed delegation is available, the threat is mitigated. That doesn't put a requirement on it, but is information to the developer community of what the threat is and what one mitigation would be.
I think this completely fails to address the issue. If I am if I own a DNSSEC signed domain, I expect certain security properties for my domain, and I'd like anybody petitioning for a certificate for my domain to be prevented by my signature from easily forging the DNSSEC or various other challenges. So the DNS or various other challenges. This needs to be a must. A should is largely pointless, just as should for CAA was pointless until the CAB Forum finally made it a must. And as to Phil's point, ICANN is the root of the DNS tree. It is not it doesn't anoint it as the super CA or anything. It just means that ICANN's answers, ultimately from ICANN's root, speak to the authenticity of the DNS reply. And that's all it speaks to. And certainly not doing DNSSEC verification doesn't improve security. All right, it doesn't take away or step on the toes of any other CA. They're not in the business of authenticating DNS responses.
Victor, I'm going to pop you to let Jacob get next after Richard.
Sure, thanks.
Feel free to join back.
So to Ted's point about documenting the threat here on mitigations, I believe we do have text in the security considerations about such threats. And there's some text in there, and I think has been there for a long time, about how you can reduce the threat while not addressing it as hard as DNSSEC does by doing validation from multiple vantage points to reduce the risk of getting bad responses. To Victor's point, I think it's a dramatic overstatement to, just step back to Ted's point. I think adding a recommendation for DNSSEC there and a description of how that counters the risks would be a fine idea. I'm happy to add that text, if it's not already there. It's there, okay. We can check and make sure it's as good as it can possibly be. I think to Victor's point about expectations of what I should expect when I sign my domain, to say that I expect my DNSSEC signature to be validated before someone requests a certificate is unfortunately hugely optimistic in the world we live in today. Given that there are a number of CAs out there, only a small number of which even are doing any flavor of ACME today. It's not really sensible to have an expectation that DNSSEC makes any particular difference. Like now that we have a CAA requirement, you might add a CAA policy that says, dear CA, please verify the DNSSEC signatures before you do anything. that I think would be a fine thing to do, and we should, it might be worthwhile to write up an extension of CA to do that. But I think, given the world we have today and the policy landscape we have today, and the assurance levels we get today, it's consistent with all of that to have DNSSEC validation be optional as part of this validation process.
Me next, or
There you go.
all right. So yeah, we have a normative recommendation for DNSSEC. Victor said that's not enough. I understand that point of view. One thing that might help inform the conversation: Let's Encrypt does validate DNSSEC today. So like all the publicly available ACME servers implement this. And so then the question of like, okay, is this the right lever to get more CAs to implement DNSSEC? I think if another CA were to come along and say, we really want to implement ACME, but we don't want to bother validating DNSSEC, or more like, if there's some reason why they don't want to validate DNSSEC, I think they won't say, wow, we want to implement ACME so badly that we're going to start validating DNSSEC now. They would just go ahead and implement ACME and ignore this because it's not actually an interoperability concern. I think more likely, hopefully, most CAs are operating and validating the resolver, but I don't think we have data about that currently.
John Dickinson. I agree with Victor's comment that it was a good idea to validate a DNS on DNS challenge if possible. But I strongly disagree with his statement that by signing my zone, I have an expectation that every query to my zone will be validated. That's completely unrealistic, and it's not anything in the DNSSEC spec that says that.
Jim Reid, I just want to agree pretty much with everything that John has just said. I would point out, however, that when you're doing validation in DNSSEC, it's not necessary to use the one true trust anchor from the ICANN administered route. So a validating resolving server could, if it chose to, set up its own trust anchor and validate off that, as well as, or instead of, the ICANN trust anchor.
Let Victor go next.
Sure, just quick. I certainly have no expectation that every DNS query from my domain will be validated. What I'm trying to get to is that the ACME CAs who might want to issue certificates from my domain would validate the DNS responses that contain the challenge verification bits. That's it. Oh, sorry, one more thing. I haven't heard yet a reason why a CA would not run a validating resolver. It's not like it takes more than 2 minutes to set one up.
Phil Hambaker. Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I'm pretty sure that most people do run validating servers. But this isn't a technical issue here. This is a practices issue, and it's a business issue. And we have to be quite careful about what requirements we have on taking trust from other places, because this is our business. And so, whereas we will make a lot of checks in the real world against databases like Dun & Bradstreet or whatever, when we actually make requirements, we do not create a lever that means that we can be forced to pay royalties to Dun & Bradstreet. ICANN charges $500,000 to apply for a domain name that's VeriSign sells for $6 a year. So this is not an organization that I want.
I think that's completely beside the point, Phil. Could you stick to the technical point, please?
No, from this point, from my point of view, it is to the point because you are creating a technical tie-in that creates a commercial risk for my business. And so, whereas you can checking to the top-level domain DNSSEC isn't particularly objectionable. If you have a requirement to check and it doesn't say what, somebody can come along and say, well, you're not checking to ICANN. So it's one of those things that it may you can say it's easy for us to do technically, but having a requirement to do it is a very different thing. Ted Hardy, the point I was trying to make is that focusing this on the cost to do a particular thing, I think actually hurts your earlier and stronger argument about this is a discussion of where we're requiring the system to import trust. And I believe Victor's point is essentially that it is the person who has created the DNSSEC signed domain who has made the linkage. And that person would like that linkage to be honored by the CA. And I believe that the point that Richard made a few minutes ago is making that part of the discovery process of does this CA support my linkage or not would be a valuable extension. Making it a permanent part of the protocol, I agree with you, is not a necessary thing for this group to do, but making it part of an extension that would allow you to discover whether or not a CA honored this linkage in this way or not, I think is quite reasonable. I also don't think that it is necessarily a 1.0 go in right now sort of thing, which leads us, and I'm going to change from this microphone to the chair microphone, to what are our next steps?
This is DKG. I just want to point out that it's already possible to tell whether a certificate authority does this by creating a false record in the DNS, a badly signed record, and submitting it and seeing whether they pass it.
Thank you for this practical information.
I was serious. This could be a sensible thing to add to CAA so that you could get the expectation that Victor espoused.
I want to agree, actually. I think that was Richard with the last call. This is Victor. The CIA suggestion actually might cover it if CAA could specify don't issue without DNSSEC. That might be another vehicle for this. I don't see anything in CAA that can do that. But me being able to check whether my chosen CA honors DNSSEC is not sufficient, because my concern is that some attacker who's not me might choose some other CA. And that they, being an ECME CA, no longer obligated by the spec to check DNSSEC will not. So it's not a question of whether I will wisely choose CAs that validate. It's an issue that the attacker will choose the least restrictive CA to attack my domain from.
I think everything to be said about this has already been said. Can we please come and move on?
The chairs do not detect sufficient consensus to even hold a hum, so we're going to move on. Yes, we're staying as it is. As you noted from the previous thing, we are going to go through another working group last call because of the changes to this. So the first question to the ISG, not yet. That's not what's going to happen now. We have to have at least one more rev of the document and one more working group last call before we take it to the ISG. So the working group last call comments that have come in and the resolutions that we've seen today do seem to us to require that. So re-working group last call, the second item here seems like our most sensible path forward here. But there is then the question, will we after that continue to hold for implementations of these changes? And I think that the question really is, although these changes are significant, do we need to call them so significant that we need for interop to be demonstrated and what level?
Well, I mean, Mr. Richard, I don't think we've had interop demonstrated on any recent draft of the spec. So I wonder if those folks who might be implementing would be willing to comment on what their timelines are looking like.
Daniel McCarney. So I think that statement's accurate. The implementation of Boulder that powers the production Let's Encrypt environment right now is kind of closer to draft 03. We're in the process of catching that up, but we're a ways off yet. I'd say 2 months is probably optimistic at this point. I don't want to be tied down to the microphone for that question.
We're also not caught up, so we don't have the current draft implemented, but we are working on that. Timelines are probably similar. I would say 3 months is optimistic for us. So
So I guess the question then is, given that timeline, we will run the working group last call before Prague, obviously, as soon as the editors give us that. Do that, and on the list, work through any new issues which come up, or any which are revisited by new information. And then it sounds like people want to lie quiet for a little while, and just before Prague, perhaps decide whether we're ready to send to the working group last call. Does that make sense as a time frame for people? Prague is in July. Everybody said 3 months, and handily, Prague is in 4. So we. Any objections to that as a proposed way forward from our area director? Woohoo! In parallel to the working group last call, then we will probably then entertain on the list any suggestions for what work items might go onto a recharter, and then we'll make discussing such a recharter the primary work of Prague, assuming that the base draft has gone to the ISG in the meantime.
Moriarty, so just one quick clarifying question. So the second working group last call would be finished before Prague, right?
Yeah,
So
we
have 4 months
anticipate
and-
that would be finished fairly quickly so that it can inform the implementations.
Great, thank you.
Anyone have objections to that way forward? Okay, sounds like we have some marching orders for our editors and a plan for the working group between now and Central Europe. So we will see you on the list. Thanks, everyone.
Please bring the blue sheets up. Everyone else is free to leave, but Richard has got to write the draft. Did we really finish that one?
Yeah, good.
Well, Colonel's trying to set speed records.
Still not.
No.
So would it be completely VA over DNS actions?
I'm sorry, what?
BGP hijacking?
Yeah, it would.
So that's already been shown-ish.
Yeah, oh,
Like FTP15.
Yeah, but Sitter's going to fix that. BGP security.
Okay.
So the
Blue sheets up front, please, and sign them if you haven't.